Hello everybody and welcome to another overnight adventure. I am out today along Eagle Eye Road south of Aguila in the foothills of the Harquahala Mountains. On this trip I'll be exploring 5 different mines, an abandoned mill site, cemetery, and looking for a scenic place to spend the night. Each of the mines I'll visit will offer some different ruins to explore, from numerous old headframes, mine adits, foundations, and a few surprises along the way. From the Snowball Fluorite Mine to the Alaska Gold Mine, the Rainbow Mine and the Tiger Mill Site, and finally on to the Victory and Apache Manganese Mines, this trip will be loaded with a broad range of abandoned mining operations dating back over the last 100 years. And because of the many stops, this adventure will probably run a bit longer than normal, but it would be full of a nice variety of desert trails ranging from well-maintained roads to rocky and narrow tracks, as well as plenty of nice views along the way. My journey today begins 60 miles west of Phoenix in the shadow of Harquahala Mountain. Located just a few miles up Eagle Eye Road sits the turnoff and staging area for the Harquahala Mountain Byway. Today would be spent exploring the west side of Eagle Eye Road, visiting 3 different mines and making camp for the night, while tomorrow would be focused on 3 more mines on the east side of the road. And while I wouldn't be doing the drive to the summit of Harquahala today, it is an incredibly scenic and worthwhile trip. The drive features a steep climb and the old Smithsonian Observatory operated at the summit during the 1920s. The staging area features informational signs, a logbook, bathroom, and plenty of parking. For this trip, I left the tires aired up for now and set off along the scenic byway. The trail headed west across the desert. My first stop of the day was just a couple miles up the road. Things remained wide and smooth for the most part. The road gently climbed and eventually turned to the northwest. Here, the grade was still very mild, but near the top can reach up to 30% in places. I continued along, navigating a few small rocky areas and eventually arriving at a turnoff 1.5 miles from the staging area. I turned off the main road as the lesser trail headed back south. It was here where I was treated to an excellent view of the surrounding desert. The trail was a bit rockier and narrower. I soon came to a small pile of tailings, which marked the location of the Snowball Mine. I parked and hopped out. As I walked down the old road, the only evidence of mining so far was the numerous waste rock piles. There were quite a few, which meant there had to be some kind of adit in the area. A few trenches remained, and as I headed further west was more evidence of activity. Finally, sunk into a pile of waste rock, I found what I was looking for: the main inclined shaft left behind at the Snowball. Some derelict wood remained around the hole. Angled metal tubing both at the top part of the shaft and a short distance to the south likely mark where a headframe once stood. The main shaft, while partially collapsed, featured an interesting double compartment. The larger left-hand side likely would have held ore cart tracks and been the primary method for removing minerals from underground. A smaller entry on the right was the manway, or access point for workers. Old ladders remain in this section and stretch down deep into the darkness. Various other concrete pads, metal rods, wooden beams, and countless other pieces of debris remain scattered around. Located in the foothills of Harquahala Mountain, the Snowball Mine was first discovered in 1943 by Dempsey B. Powell while hunting in the area. He found the area to be rich in fluorspar, better known as fluorite, a mineral used in the production of glass optics and enamels, as well as a source for other manufacturing acids. 5 mining claims were established, and in 1944, the Snowball was investigated by the U.S. Bureau of Mines as part of their War Minerals Report. Diamond drilling took place, and the Bureau completed several bulldozer cuts to assess the value of the property. The Bureau also improved 6.5 miles of road to access the property. The Snowball was found to have good tonnage of ore in place, but it wouldn't be fully developed until 1957 when ownership changed hands. By 1958, the mine was operated by Monolith Portland Cement Company, who employed up to 14 people at the mine and had developed the inclined shaft down to the 100-foot level. A small mill was later built on site to process ore before it was shipped out. Rocks pulled out of the ground were found to contain anywhere from 40 to 70% calcium fluoride. This ore was then used in the creation of Portland cement. Operation seems to have ceased in the decades following, and ownership of the Snowball changed hands again in 1972. While another company had further plans to develop and work the property, they went out of business in 1975, and no further activity occurred at the mine since. While not a huge or overly successful operation, it was still neat to see the Snowball, and the inclined shaft was an unexpected treat. I returned back to the Jeep and got back on the trail. From here, I would be partially retracing my route to get to the next stop, just a bit to the south. I followed Harquahala Byway a short distance as it descended back into Harquahala Plain. It wasn't long and I was soon following BLM Road 9342 as it split off from the main road, past the picnic table, and continued to the south. At this point, the trail immediately got less maintained. It meandered south towards the small Weldon Hill, now visible up ahead. If everything continued as planned, I would be setting up camp right next to the hill a little bit later. Things remained narrow as I passed all kinds of different cacti and desert shrubbery. This section was incredibly scenic and enjoyable. About 1.5 miles from the Snowball Mine, a windmill came into view, and I pulled off at the ruins of the Alaska Mine. This stop featured considerably more structures left behind today. Not a lot is known about the early workings of the Alaska, but records indicate that it was discovered by a Mr. A. Johnson, who found the area to be rich in gold in the early 1920s. The property was leased and worked by the Alaskan Mining Corporation, who constructed a 50-ton mill on site and drilled a well on the property. Depending on the source, the Alaska produced between several thousand and several $100,000 worth of ore from the 1920s to the early 1930s. And this was from a combination of mostly gold, some copper, and lesser amounts of silver. During this time, about 1,200 tons of ore had been removed, and several structures were constructed on site. By 1933, it appears that most of the gold operation had stopped at the Alaska, and the Alaskan Mining Corporation acquired additional claims in the area. The property began with 33 mining claims and would go on to support up to 98 in total. These additional claims included adits to the south, known as the Rainbow Group, several around Weldon Hill, and a few more to the west. The operation seemed to go by many names over its history, including the Copper Penny, Silver Thread, and Two Sisters. After its initial workings through the 1930s, the Alaska Group appeared to quiet down, with no known operations for the next 30 years. It wasn't until 1968 when activity was renewed by a new owner, Gene Chisholm. The property was reassayed, drilled, and dozer operations began at some of the older workings. While the Alaska property still showed some amounts of gold, copper, and silver, The Rainbow property to the south was also found to be rich in fluorspar, much like the Snowball. While some operations appear to have been completed by Chisholm throughout the early 1970s, it seems that nothing more ever came from the property. Despite extraordinary claims that a possible 100 million tons of ore remained throughout the property, after renewed drilling operations in 1986, activity ceased permanently and the mine has sat abandoned ever since. Today, the Alaska remains as a shell of its former self. Numerous concrete foundations are scattered around, which likely would have housed equipment for the mill, generators, or compressors operating on site. Some are just large stands, while others hold metal rods and pipes. An interesting metal stack remains, towering above the other ruins. This is cemented at the bottom and has apparently been used as target practice in the years since. The largest ruin is the metal tank, which was used as a steam boiler. Underneath it, wood timbers and metal scraps are strewn about. Despite a few bullet holes, this heavy-duty boiler remains in decent shape. One of the unique things in the rubble pile is an old piece of machinery, complete with different gears and old numbering. This is attached to a long metal rod with the sharp point at the end. It is unclear what this is, but perhaps it was an old drill or well equipment at one point. It almost seems like a windmill once stood here, as concrete pads and long metal pieces remain near it. Other concrete ruins remain throughout the property. To the east sits an active windmill and corral, which may have been the original water source for operations. A small cattle pond, formed by an earthen dam, remains west of the main ruins. It blocks a small wash that runs past the operation. It is in this wash where most of the adits for the Alaska mine sit. Hidden in the wall of the wash is one of the inclined shafts. While partially gated and signed, the door remained wide open. However, due to the fact that the roof was made up of nothing but loosely packed sediment, it seemed a little questionable to go down in. While it does appear to turn to solid rock part of the way down, a collapse seems real easy in this area. Regardless, it's one of the more unique adits I've seen, and I imagine some water could rush in during flash floods. A short way down the wash is another set of mine portals. A large horizontal cut that has been dug out features a skylight where the roof was open, letting some sunlight in. Back on the other side of the wash sits another small vertical opening. Looking in, it seems to be in rough shape and may have been an escapeway or access point. A few other adits remain further downstream. Back out of the wash, a seemingly random metal pipe sticks out of the ground. It is unclear what this connects to, but it could connect to deeper levels of the mine below and provide ventilation. The Alaska certainly has plenty of interesting things to look at, and a decently interesting history. You can find all kinds of things walking around the property. However, it was now time to continue on to my last stop for the day and get to finding camp. I left the Alaska and continued south towards Weldon Hill. The trail remained narrow and rocky, slowly descending into the otherwise flat and wide open Harquahala Plain. Past the trail intersection, things got a bit rougher in places, but overall remained easy. As I headed west, another large pile of waste rock lined the edge of the trail. Naturally, I had to stop and check it out. This was part of the Rainbow Group workings, which relates back to the Alaska mine just to the north. The Rainbow produced copper and fluorite, but other than a pile of old tailings, there wasn't much worth looking at. From the Rainbow Mine, I continued west. The trail continued past a few small hills and a couple more adits before it turned back south. It remained scenic as the foothills of the Harquahalas loomed ahead. After checking a fairly new mining claim marker, I continued on a spur trail towards the large hill, and soon arrived at a clearing that would serve as my camp for the night. Alright, and we have made it to our planned camping area for the night. Got a great view. We're in kind of the foothills of the Harquahala Mountains. I can see the road kind of way up at the top, and the observatory would be right there at the high point. But it's been a great day today. We've been hitting all the stuff we want to see. Like I said, we're at our planned campsite here in this kind of low hilly area known as Weldon Hill. And aside from the incredible amounts of broken glass that are around, this is going to be a pretty good campsite for the night. So we're in this little bowl of hills, sheltered from the wind a little bit. Got some great views and of course lots of privacy, so that's going to be great. Next up will be setting up camp, which won't take too long. Get the tent popped open, kitchen out, and then it'll be on to relaxing for the night. And then tomorrow morning, waking up, heading back to Eagle Eye Road. We're going to check out some more mines on the east side of the road. But now it's time to get camp ready and relax for the night. With the Jeep leveled, the first order of business was getting the tent opened up. That didn't take long, and it was soon on to getting the rest of camp ready. I got my table and chair out, lights set up, and a camp box ready to cook dinner in a bit. Within 15 minutes, everything was ready, and I decided to set out for a short hike and explore the surrounding area. From camp, I headed uphill. It didn't take long, and I had soon gained enough elevation to take in the tremendous view that surrounded me. The massive Harquahala Plain went on about as far as the eye could see. The jagged Bighorn Peak, Saddle Mountain, and the rugged Eagle Tail Mountains made up the horizon from east to west. The 5,600-foot summit of Harquahala made up the view to the north of camp. A small prospect pit, unfortunately used as a modern-day trash pit, sat just downhill. There was still a couple hours until the sun set, but a light breeze blowing and some mild weather made for a really great afternoon. Back at camp, it was getting to be that time. I cracked open an ice-cold beverage and sat down to enjoy the rest of the evening. Today had been a fun and productive day, and overall a great start to my trip. While I had only covered half of the mine's plan so far, the relaxing pace, interesting stops, and great views along the way had been perfect. The small Weldon Hill provided just enough elevation to break up the wind, and provided a perfect spot to camp out. A few more mine adits could be seen on the south face of the hill, which were operated as part of the Rainbow Group. By 6 o'clock, the sun was getting lower in the sky, and it was time to get started on dinner. I got the kitchen ready and fired up the stove. Dinner tonight would be something sort of new. I got the chicken and homemade rice warmed up and seasoned. It was then on to getting the fresh tortillas heated up and a nice cheese base melted in between the two. After that, it was a matter of combining everything back together, wrapping it up, and my chicken quesarito was soon ready to go. Paired with some fresh green salsa and another beer, I sat down to enjoy. And while it didn't turn out quite like I was hoping, it was still really good. I watched the sun set and the surrounding desert terrain slowly slipped into darkness. After some dishes, I eventually retreated to the tent where I relaxed a bit longer and enjoyed the night sky. By 10 o'clock, I called it a night and drifted off to sleep. I was up around 6:30 the next morning, just before first light. Outside the tent, it was calm and cool. Last night I slept really well. Other than a few coyotes, things had been quiet, and the temperature only dropped into the high 40s or lower 50s. I watched as the first light of the day hit the summit of the Harquahalas. The surrounding desert was slowly basked in sunlight. I remained up in the tent for a while, enjoying the serene view. I did have a lot planned for the day, so I wanted to get out of camp earlier than normal, but I wasn't in a huge rush. After almost an hour up in the tent, I was finally up and around. I pulled the stove back out, fired it up, and got some water boiling for breakfast. While waiting on this, I managed to get the tent broken down and packed up. With the water soon ready, I got oatmeal prepped and coffee made, and sat down to eat and enjoy a few more minutes of the view. The tight switchbacks and steep sections of the Harquahala Byway loomed on the mountainside in the distance. After breakfast and a bit more cleaning, I soon got the rest of my gear packed away. A little before 10, I fired up the Jeep and picked up my traction pads. From camp, I headed back for the main road. I would be retracing a little bit of the BLM roads from yesterday back to the Rainbow Mine. From there, I stayed due east in the direction of Eagle Eye Road, which I would need to use to get to my next stop. The trail out was mostly easy. A few wash crossings slowed my pace in a few areas, but generally things were smooth sailing. As I left behind Weldon Hill, the Harquahala Plain opened up and the views improved once again. The Eagle Tail and Bighorn Mountains were visible to my east and south. Just a couple miles from camp, I approached the paved road. From here, I would need to head north a few miles where I had several more stops planned. Going south from here connects back to Salome Highway and I-10. I stayed north, passing back by the Harquahala staging area where I started my trip yesterday. I continued on the paved road for about 5 miles before turning back onto a dirt trail. My first stop of the day was visible from Eagle Eye Road. Some interesting foundations remain, perched on a small hill just east of the road. I initially parked at the top of the hill, but soon relocated to the bottom for easier access. Walking around the ruins, there was certainly a lot to look at. The lowest level featured interesting pink clay tailings and a mixture of fine black pebbles. Working my way uphill, large concrete pads, steps, metal railing, and metal tanks remain filled to the brim with material. The uppermost levels featured wooden support beams, a partially collapsed concrete box, and a lot more waste rock piled up. Other debris, including metal siding, thick cables, and other random scraps, remain strewn about. This was certainly interesting, but something very obvious was missing: any mine adits or shafts. This appeared to be the remains of a milling operation. The arrangement of equipment in a sort of vertical configuration, and the fact that the rocks got progressively smaller as I traveled downhill was a good indication. However, there was nothing marked on any historic maps of the area. While there are several mines in the area, which include the Black Queen, about a third of a mile away, the Victory and Apache mines, which I would continue on to a bit later, along with El Tigre, Black Rock, and several others all along the same road, it wasn't clear which one it was attached to or when it was operated. And after digging through over 100 pages of old mine records, something finally connected. It appears that this mill was built in the early 1920s to serve El Tigre mine. El Tigre, or the Tiger Mine, operated as early as 1918. Ore was initially shipped to Aguila, but to save on transportation costs, a mill was built closer to the mine. Located 3.5 miles northwest of the mine and 1,500 feet south of a well, which is marked by a windmill today, this mill site seemed to match the description. This 10-stamp milling operation is talked about in an annual shareholders report from 1922. El Tigre Mining Company poured over $50,000 into the mine and mill property. By 1925, the mill had processed at least 4,200 tons of ore, producing over $14,000 in gold profits. Operations at the mine appeared to die out by the late 1920s, although the property was reacquired in the 1980s by Canex Resources, who reworked some of the properties in the area and looked into using a heap leaching operation. It is possible that this work was done at the old mill site, and the remains left today are a mixture of operations done in the 1920s and the 1980s. While El Tigre was responsible for building and operating the mill, it is highly likely that the many other mines that popped up in the area afterwards also utilized the property via a lease to save on development costs. While certainly a bit of a deep dive, the mill site was worth the stop. I returned back to the main trail and continued east. My next 2 stops along this spur trail were only a couple miles further off the paved road. The trail remained narrow, rutted out in a few places, but busier than yesterday. I eventually split off the main trail again and followed a track as it descended into a wash. Things were narrower along this section as I continued south across the wash. On the other side, the road briefly climbed before ending at yet another large pile of tailings. This time, a headframe poked above the rock piles. This was the Victory No. 1 and 2 mine. Not the catchiest name, but yet another different type of mine. As I climbed towards the headframe, a large hole caught my eye. While most mines feature a designated portal or entrance, it seems like the Victory had several large chasms dug out below the surface. Known as a type of stope, although technically called a coffin, these diggings angled down from the surface and were supported by some questionable timbers. The area featured many holes, varying in size, and showed how easy it could be to take a wrong step and tumble down into. It was interesting to see the different workings. I crossed back over a narrow footbridge, over the open areas, and made it to the headframe at the top of the ruins. While not overly tall, this wooden headframe remained well preserved. It led down to a small inclined shaft that looked to be filled with collapsed rock and more timbers. On the other side, another large cavity remains dug out. A large number of black boulders, some coated with a slight purple tinge, remain piled up around the property, and several concrete foundations remain at the lower levels. The Victory Mine appeared to be a small operation. Production at the mine started in 1918 after it was discovered by John Rogers. The mine produced manganese, used in a variety of steel and aluminum alloys in the industrial field. Early ore values were high, although they slowly tapered off with continued development. The property appears to have been worked intermittently after 1918, with new ownership taking over in 1942. After this, there is no record of operation, and the property likely shut down due to more favorable prospects in the nearby area. While not a huge operation, the interesting open stopes, large rock pile, and intact headframe were neat to look at. I returned back to the Jeep and got back on the trail. From here, I had one more mine to check out since I was in the area. I retraced my path back to the wash and stayed right to continue east. Clearance was a bit of an issue, but I soon emerged from the wash and rejoined the more traveled Little Horn Peak Road. The trail became wider, but within a mile, I was turning back off the main road once more. The trail meandered south, crossing a couple small washes and getting progressively more difficult. After a bit of slow and go, the trail soon split again and I stayed right towards my last stop. Before I knew it, the trail dropped into some old ruins and I was once again parking the Jeep to explore the area. This was the Apache Mine, also known as the Dulce or the Gallagher and Flynn Mine. The mine was originally discovered during World War I, and the first production occurred in 1918. Known then as the Gallagher and Flynn, it produced about 70 tons of moderate-grade manganese ore. The claims were later relocated in 1951 by a new owner, and by 1953, the mine had shipped 250 tons of ore. Ownership changed hands again in 1958 as Hans Christoffersen took over the property. By this point, much of the higher grade ore had played out, but production remained high. 25 to 30 tons a week were shipped from the Apache. Christoffersen constructed a jig concentration mill on the property to help refine the lower grade ore that was being pulled out of the ground. By this point, the mine had 2 short shafts and a 100-foot-long stope connecting them. But by 1960, it appears that the property played out with little to no activity occurring in the years since. While no real evidence of the jig mill remains, the Apache still has several interesting things left to look at. Aside from the Alaska mine, it probably has the most remnants today. A very unique wooden structure remains at the workings. What appears to be some kind of headframe stands above the dugout area. Made up of various wooden beams and metal parts, it appears to have held up to the test of time, but was unlike anything I've ever seen at any other mine. The stoped out area is a decent size and contains a few more timbered supports. This area was more well fenced off and contained piles of overburden and various other random debris. Some additional concrete foundations remain north of the workings. This could have been a processing or loading area for outgoing ore. Another small vertical shaft remains, but perhaps one of the most interesting things left at the Apache is the 2 vehicles. One is an old truck, which has since been stripped down and flipped over. This appears to have been about a 1976 Dodge Dakota work truck. Further away from the workings sits an older car. With suicide doors and a futuristic look, this car appears to be what's left of a 1950s era Studebaker Champion sedan. While the engine and most other parts have been stripped or shot at, the steering wheel, a few door handles, fenders, and the outline of the original badge remains. This was truly a unique find and really makes you wonder when and how these vehicles ended up in such a remote spot. A few other random structures remain strewn about the property. This had really been an interesting place to explore with some unique remnants left behind. while a few other mines remain east of the Apache, including the Black Rock Pit, which I visited on a prior trip. It was time for me to start heading back towards the paved road. From the Apache, I retraced my route back along the desert trails, eventually returning to Little Horn Road. I followed the 2.5 miles of trail back out to pavement, which slowly improved as I headed west, and I soon found myself back at the paved Eagle Eye Road. From here, I opted to continue northbound towards Aguila. The road passes by the remains of Ambrosia Mill, another large manganese processing plant, and the turnoff to the Purple Pansy Mine, which I visited on another overnight trip a couple years ago. As I headed north, the namesake for the road finally came into view. A small hill with a natural arch, known as the Eagle Eye, rose up ahead. As I approached, I found myself turning off the paved road for one more quick stop before wrapping up my trip. At the end of a small spur, I came to the Eagle Eye Cemetery. Located below the small hill, this desert cemetery serves as the final resting place for many residents of the nearby area. I walked the grounds of the cemetery. The graves date from as early as the 1950s to one as recent as 2020. Several veterans are laid to rest, including one from the Spanish-American War, one from World War I, and several from World War II. The cemetery was a quiet and serene way to wrap up my journey along Eagle Eye Road, and it also had some great views of the small hills and Eagle Eye, which rose up above. I returned to the Jeep and followed the paved highway back east to Wickenburg, and eventually home to civilization. This trip had been packed with some incredible historic stops. I managed to visit 5 different mines, 1 old mill site, and a cemetery in my 2 days of exploring. Each stop had proven to be a little bit different and showcased just how different some of these old mining operations and prospects can be. From the ruins of the Snowball Mine to the expansive surface and underground ruins of the Alaska Gold Mine, the tailings left behind of the Rainbow Group, the old El Tigre Mill, and the Victory and Apache manganese operations, this trip had been fascinating around every turn. The operations spanned the last 100 years, dating from as early as 1918 to as recent as the 1980s. And I managed to enjoy a great night camped out at the scenic Weldon Hill, located on the boundary of the foothills of the Harquahala Mountains and the Harquahala Plain. I know this trip was a bit longer than normal with numerous stops, but I hope you enjoyed this look back in time. I certainly enjoyed myself traversing the back roads and visiting each of these old mines. Hopefully you learned a bit and maybe even found a few new places to check out yourself. If you enjoy trips like this, be sure to check out our channel and consider subscribing to keep up with future adventures. Thanks so much for tagging along today, and as always, we'll see you on the next one.